Well, a very good afternoon to you all, wherever you may be joining us from. My name is Simon Tupman. I'm the presenter of the monthly Law Chat series, and welcome to the October edition 2022, brought to you in conjunction with Law Markhams, accountants and advisors specialising in financial services for the legal profession. And it's my great pleasure to welcome my guest today, who's Clive Elliott KC. He's a barrister. He's past president of the New Zealand Bar Association, and he's also author of a new book recently published called The Power of Wellbeing, which basically examines the society that we live in, as he says, torn apart and bedeviled by corrupt and incompetent leadership, ill will, inequality, and a growing lack of trust. And the book effectively offers a blueprint for rebuilding the social fabric and reimagining an inclusive society. Clive, thank you very much for joining us this month.
It's a pleasure. Nice to see you again, Simon.
I've been reading your book and I've been very much enjoying it because I think it certainly cuts through a lot of the social media waffle and addresses some of the real issues that our society is confronting or having to confront, albeit overshadowed perhaps by disturbances in Ukraine and also in Iran, but perhaps heightening the tensions that society feels generally. But it's not only society. I think it's probably fair to say that the legal profession has also been facing something of a well-being crisis in some ways, and I'd like to steer the conversation towards that as we chat this afternoon. But firstly, I'd like to ask you, what drove you to write this book?
Well, what drove me to write it was actually, funnily enough, the 2019 mosque attacks in Christchurch. And prior to that, I'd been concerned by the drift towards or away from democracy in the US, which continues as we speak. And I wondered why the West was in decline and why extremism was growing. And I had this feeling of disquiet about things, but I wasn't quite sure how I could put my finger on it until one day in April 2019, I was in court and someone said, I'm not sure if it was my opponent or the registrar, said, there's been some incident in Christchurch. That was in the early afternoon. I knew nothing more about that, but when I got back to chambers, I saw a number of the juniors upstairs looking very morbid and quiet, and they said, something's happened, but we're still not quite sure what. I then went home and watched the media release by the Prime Minister where she outlined what had happened, and I was actually stunned that over 50 people had been shot in cold blood in New Zealand, and I thought, what the hell's happening to the world? And that really... That was the catalyst for me to say, it's no use just thinking about things. You've got to do something positive. And this book was my little attempt to address that disquiet.
And a significant attempt too, if I may say so, because I think it's been incredibly well researched, and you've obviously interviewed a lot of people along the way to try and gain some answers to this disquiet that the Western society is facing. Why do you conclude that things are not going well?
Well, I feel, and this is my view, that the US is an incredibly important country in terms of democracy. And what happens in the US is going to happen to the rest of the world, because they are really the beacon of light that we've all followed for generations. And I feel that the US is in real trouble. And that's why I compared the US to New Zealand. And it may seem an odd comparison, but that was my reason, was to compare what was happening in the largest democracy in the world and a small but successful democracy, New Zealand. So that was really the basis that I concluded that there was a problem that needed to be confronted.
And it is an interesting comparison that you make. In some ways, am I right to interpret the fact that you suggest New Zealand, in spite of its own social problems, can be something of an exemplar to the world in promoting, as you refer to it, the general well-being?
I think it is, because I think in a way New Zealand has embraced well-being as a principle or concept of governance for some time now, and the current government's reference to its well-being budgets are not new. And as I set out in the book, as you may have seen, Simon, a lot of this thinking was actually initiated by National. So it's not a Labor idea at all. I think Labor have been good at branding it and sloganizing it, but I think National were actually the instigators.
Yes.
Yes, so there is a deep ingrained well-being value in New Zealand that I think we need to recognise.
And tell me, since you've written the book, which I think was published about 4 or 5 months ago, what has been the reaction to it?
I've had very good reactions to it, and I've had very good reviews. I've had very good feedback from people that have read it, and one of the you get small bits of feedback from people who you don't expect it from. And I just a couple of weeks ago, I had a client conference, and once we'd concluded our business, my client said to me, "And by the way, I've just finished your book. I really enjoyed it." And for me, that was really uplifting, because I thought, well, who knows who's reading it? And even if there are 100 people who are influenced by it, I'll take that as a win.
Well, congratulations to you. And as one author to another, it's always great when you sort of get that sort of feedback from people who say, "Oh, by the way, I read your book and I liked it." So and I'm sure it's going to influence a hell of a lot more than 100 people, Clive. I guess some of the gist of the book is summed up by an opening quote in it by Jeremy Bentham back in 1776, in which you put in there the quote, "It's the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong." And implicit, I guess, in that quote is the fact that we have an imbalance in our society between the haves, the have-nots, an unequal society, increasing insecurity, lack of safety, and perhaps diminishing health and hope. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, it is. I think Bentham really was and what I discovered was that Bentham had a big influence on the creation of New Zealand when the treaty was signed in 1840. And Professor Moon from AUT, who I interviewed twice about this, actually gave me one of his papers that he'd written on Bentham's influence on the treaty. And the interesting thing is that Bentham was trying to create, and he didn't believe in colonialism, but he believed that if the Crown was going to sign a treaty, they should do it on a utilitarian basis and to actually look after the well-being or the welfare of all people, European and Maori. So it's fascinating to actually dig back into our history, because well-being, I believe, was actually there from day one, at least in terms of New Zealand, the New Zealand we know today.
And by the sounds of it, we ignore it at our peril.
Well, we do, and we did for many years, because the treaty was not honoured for many years. But I've argued in the book that we've rediscovered our mojo by re-embracing the treaty and trying to implement it in the manner it was intended.
So New Zealand may have that advantage. You mentioned the United States a little earlier. How do you think they're going to address this issue?
I don't know. To be honest with you, I see the US drifting further into a divisive society between red and blue, where the two just can't speak to each other. And I think that's a huge problem, because part of the concept of well-being is you try and have policies that are good for the majority of people, not for a small minority. And by that I mean the billionaires who are funding the Republican Party.
So, and I guess we see it in other countries too. I mean, we've seen a swing to the right in Europe, also we see what's going on with Russia. Some people might say the pendulum always swings, but perhaps after some purging or at some cost. Are you optimistic about the future, or do you think we've got some dark times ahead?
I am an optimist by nature, but I think that there has to be some significant readjustment in the US if it's going to find itself again. I think New Zealand has much better prospects in the long term, because I think that we are grappling with the problems we're talking about of inequality, of of not recognizing the treaty in the sense it was intended. Um, but we do have major problems in New Zealand as well in terms of domestic violence is huge here. The drug problem is massive. The gang problem is huge. And these are problems that are going to have to be dealt with. But if we do so in a manner which I set out in the book, which is really to actually understand the problems and try and deal with them in a pragmatic way, and not in a doctrinaire manner, I think we've got a very good chance of being not just a good country,
but also a leading example to other countries.
Definitely. I think that smaller countries like New Zealand can actually show the way, because we've always been a social laboratory in New Zealand, and I think we've been open to change over the years. And you look at women's rights, for example. First country to give the full vote to women. The Indigenous people got the vote really early in New Zealand. So we've been open to change, and I think we need to congratulate ourselves for that openness to change, and to actually sell the message to the rest of the world. And I mean, only this week we've seen Australia finally accept that in terms of their budget process, they should be looking at wellbeing principles for the first time. And I did a post on LinkedIn a few days ago, you may have seen it, basically saying it was only 2 years ago that Josh Frydenberg pilloried Labor for even thinking about looking at the well-being of its citizens, and that this was really left-wing spin. And I think he referred to people walking around with beads and prayer mats, to the laughter of his colleagues on the back benches. Well, 2 years later, that's exactly what's happening in Australia. So I think that we are an example that we should be telling the world about.
Do you think it's just the responsibility of government to address these issues, or also the responsibility of business as well as individuals in the community?
No, definitely, it's not just government. And as I argue in my book, well-being has to start with the individual. We all have to make sure that we are well, that's physically and mentally, and to ensure that members of our family are equally well. And only then can we look at the community we live in. And I'm talking to you now from home, and I look down the lane that I live in, and our community is very close. We all look after each other. I've just brought someone's bin in, for example, and it's little things like that that are important. And then we have to look at the local community, so the suburb, then the city, before we can look at the country, because it's the onion concept. We start with ourselves, and then we look at the region and the world as a whole. Not small, and then look outwards. But we need to look out, not in.
I thought your book closed with a very good appendices in terms of what individuals can do to develop their own well-being plan. Yes. Do you want to share a couple of those tips that appeared in the appendix?
Well, yes. In the appendix, what I did was I actually tried to have some practical guidance as to what you can do. And I think for example, just talking about well-being, there are people who are well-being practitioners who practice well-being. And so if you are not well, and you are having personal problems, there are websites you can go to. There's support groups. You can go to practitioners, and they are skilled enough to be able to refer you up the chain if you need more help. There are also practical practical tips in there about, I mean, the opposite of well-being is ill-being, and that is if you are living in a domestic violence situation that you can't get out of. And this is a terrible situation that a lot of people, women mainly, are subjected to in New Zealand. I've provided links in there to contact organisations that will help you. And there are organisations where people, just average people, have started networks, support networks, based on their upbringing, where they've grown up in an abusive family. So there are lots of small, and there's John Kerwin's organisation. There are, and all the details are in there. So what I would suggest is that people who are interested can read the book, and I start big, and then I end up small in terms of practical individual steps that we can all take.
Indeed, and I heartily recommend some of those suggestions too. I wonder, it's interesting if I can bring the focus a little bit more onto the legal profession. You've been a barrister for many years now,
yes.
And your title recently changed from QC to KC,
Yes.
as a result of the passing of the monarch. But it's interesting that when we first met, which was some probably 25 years ago at least, I was in the throes of writing my own first book, in which I catalogued statistics that hardly paid a compliment to the well-being of the legal profession. I recall recounting statistics on high rates of depression, stress, and so on. And one could say plus ça change, because here we are in 2022, and in recent years, there have been numerous studies carried out by bar associations around the world suggesting that the legal profession are hardly exemplars when it comes to well-being. So, for example, in 2017, over in the United States, the American Bar Association formed a task force on lawyer well-being, in which they reported on high levels of chronic stress, depression, and substance abuse. And I'm quoting here, "We have to act now. It's incompatible with a sustainable legal profession, the current status quo, and that change requires a candid assessment of our state of being and a courageous commitment to re-envisaging what it means to live the life of a lawyer."
Yeah.
So in many ways, it would suggest that, well-being is an issue for everyone, even lawyers and members of the legal profession who are regarded as being, if you like, leaders in our community.
Definitely. I think that people recognise now that, I mean, the Australian Bar Association has a wellbeing program, which is active, and so does the New Zealand Bar Association. The Law Society is doing it. So it's based around supporting practitioners who need help, and it starts right from the point of a lawyer who's got a difficult file, who can't, for whatever reason, deal with it, and all you need is someone to talk to, or get a second opinion, or someone else to look at that file, or take it off your hands because there might be a blockage for some reason, all the way up to the issues you've talked about, which are are chronic depression and substance abuse. And the problem we've got in our profession is that we are very used to being stoic and not showing our weakness. And so we're very good at bottling things up. But the problem is that that stress has to go somewhere. And that's where lawyers are known to be big drinkers. Takes the pressure off. You come home and have a glass of wine, and maybe you have another one, and then another one. But the thing is, if you do that on an ongoing basis, then you could end up with a drinking problem. So I think we have to be we have to acknowledge the problem, and I think programs like mentoring programs are so important. And the Bar Association has a very, very good mentoring program, and I've been involved in it for a number of years. But the point I'd like to make about that is that I believe that I've actually learned and gained more from being a mentor than I believe my mentees have. And I think that senior people need to recognize that mentoring is actually a very productive and positive experience for both parties.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's a lot we can do to make the profession and our members healthier, to live better lives, and to achieve more.
And just considering that further and perhaps broadening the scope, whilst there are wellness programs and charters, that the phrase they might use in the UK, that various firms have set up to try and provide support for practitioners who may be experiencing difficulties, do you feel that these programs go far enough, or do you feel that instead of addressing the symptoms, we as a profession need to do more to address the causes?
Well, we do. I think that, and this is your area more than mine, Simon, but I think that part of the problem we've got, and particularly in bigger law firms with very high standards and expectations, is that the huge demands put on young lawyers, and in fact all their lawyers, to perform. And the problem is, how do you balance that with the need for people to be healthy and to actually be well-rounded as individuals? And it's a lot easier at the bar, because you're your own master, and you can decide to turn down a brief if you're not up to it, or you've got too much work on and you don't feel you can do a good job. Whereas if you've got a bunch of partners saying, well, I don't think your budget's looking very good, what are you going to do about it? You're under real pressure then.
So all of a sudden we're going to see a spike in people becoming independent barristers, maybe.
Yes.
Is that one of the reasons that took you away from private practice to the independent bar?
No, it wasn't. There were other reasons, and mainly team meetings were one of them.
Yeah.
I was team meetinged out, I think, is one way of putting it.
Yeah, well said. Clive, I don't know if you have children, but if you did have children, would you advise them to pursue a career in law?
No, I don't, but I would do. I think the law is a great profession. And I still remember Justice Jeffreys saying when I was admitted many years ago, that you were joining a noble and learned profession. And I think he was undoubtedly right. It is both noble and learned, and we need to maintain those values because they are so important. And it is ultimately a profession. It's not a business.
Yeah.
And those are the things we need to keep. But we need to support each other as well. And I think the independent bar is very good at doing that, because we live in a adversarial environment where we constantly at daggers with each other. But we still have to get on as friends, because we're all human beings.
I suppose the rule in society in many ways. Going back to the big picture again, and I'm sure that the legal profession fits into this, but I note in your book that you advocate a solution to the well-being crisis, if I can put it that, and that's the framework that you called MUST, M-U-S-T.
Yes.
Means utility, sustainability, and trust. Do you want to spend a few moments just explaining that to us? Because that seems to embody much of what you espouse in the book in terms of a solution.
Yes, because we can talk about well-being, and I think everyone wants to be well, but how do you achieve it? And so I've built my thesis around those four propositions, and the M is the means. The M of must. We need to have the economic means to pay for well-being, and that means that we need a strong economy to pay for the social policies that I advocate for. So it's really important that if it's one thing being socially liberal, which I am, but we have to be fiscally responsible. And this was Bill English's message: is you've got to run the country well. So that's the most important thing, because if we don't actually have economic well-being, then all these other policies are going to be unaffordable. So that's the must, or the M of must.
Mm-hmm.
The U is utility, which is Jeremy Bentham's principle, which is central to what I'm putting forward, is that you try and achieve policies which achieve the most good for the most people, rather than just a couple of or group of in society, the very wealthy, for example. And you don't ignore the people at the bottom of the heap. You actually focus on them and really try and help them. So that's the utility concept. And then the third is sustainability. And in a way, sustainability should really be the most important thing, because if we don't have a sustainable environment, we lose humanity. Humanity will disappear. So that's absolutely a massive issue. So we've got to come up with green energy, and we've got to get rid of fossil fuels. And so the government's on the right track finally on that. And the fourth, and probably I said sustainability was the most important, but equally important is the T, which is trust. And when I was researching this book, I actually went to Finland, and I was going to write about Finland as well, but that's turned into another project. And I was amazed at how many people I interviewed, and I said, what is the most important feature of Finnish society that makes it so successful? Because it is a very successful society. And just about everyone said trust. And I suddenly thought about it. Why is this word trust coming up so often? And I realized that trust is actually the glue that holds society together. It's the glue that allows you and I to talk to each other as equals and to respect each other's views, because you trust me and I trust you. So ultimately, trust is the most important thing. And if that's the only outcome from well-being policies, we've achieved a lot.
Absolutely. I'm tempted to ask you, are you interested in standing for politics at any stage?
No, not really. The book is apolitical, and decidedly so.
It's interesting, though, whether or not policies and politics, even in a country like New Zealand, can become less divisive, so that parties across the spectrum are actually pursuing a relatively common agenda, which is designed to achieve the utility that you refer to in your solution there.
Absolutely. And what I'm hoping is that this book will help parties on both sides of the political aisle to embrace well-being as a central core concept of this country, which is not used as a political football. And that's why I've tried to argue that it's not a Labour idea, it's not a national idea, it's our idea. And I'd love some of our politicians to listen to this podcast, and I'd invite you to invite them to do so, because I'd love to hear both leaders say well-being is it's an absolute and it's not negotiable.
Absolutely. Well, we'll see what we can do, Clive. My contacts down at the Beehive aren't that strong, but you never know. There's a few MPs that I have come across who are lawyers, so you never know. We might be able to get them to view this. But can I just say thank you very much for being my guest today. Congratulations on the book, and I hope it gets all the praise and attention that it deserves. And you mentioned there's another project regarding Finland. Is that another book?
It is another book, yes. I was going to compare Finland and New Zealand with the US, but I was told to just focus on New Zealand. I was getting a bit ahead of myself.
Yeah.
My publisher.
Well, very good. Well, best of luck with the next book, Clive, and I look forward to keeping in touch. But for now, thanks for coming on Law Chat today.
Thanks, Simon. It's been a great pleasure. Nice to see you again.
Lovely talking to you too. Bye-bye.
Okay. Cheerio.
Bye-bye.
Bye.